Hey, good afternoon. We have Randi Kaplan here, who is the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. Randi, can you give us a little more information about yourself?
Hi, I'm Randi Kaplan. We're down here in Pennsylvania. I'm married. We have a toddler, and my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. He died in, Walter Feiden. He died in 2017, I want to say. He was 89. Um, I guess I was 35 at that time. So we had a long time to get to know him for sure. Um,
That's great. Wow.
um,
It's very interesting to know like different stories from survivors and the stories that they pass on to their descendants. So where was your grandfather from in Vienna?
he was from Vienna. They lived in sort of a fancy neighborhood, the Gas, sort of down the street from the Sigmund Freud Museum over there. His father had a movie theater. They played American films there. Um, they were assimilated people. They weren't like Orthodox or anything. They were not religious hardly at all. Um, and they lived in an assimilated neighborhood. And were just in general like secular people. Um, they were Jews, but they, didn't live in like a Jewish community, I wouldn't say, as best I know. Um,
So you said that your grandfather's parents, they owned a movie theater, so he came from a pretty well-off family in Vienna.
I would say so. Yeah, I mean they owned the concession for the movie theater, and it was a fancy neighborhood they lived in. If you look at it now, I mean it's looks like Central Park East or something. It's looks pretty nice.
Okay, so wow. And what's it called? When did this all happen? It's great. I mean, it's pretty interesting to know that even what it when it came to the Nazis, they didn't discriminate, but based on what's it called social classes, they took everybody when it came as long like there was so much hate and bigotry when it came to the Holocaust. So how did this all happen? How did your grandfather become a part of this? When was he? When did this all?
He was a child. He was born in 1928. So he was in, I guess, what you call elementary school at that time. At some point before things got really bad, there were some changes in education. There it turns out that the Jewish professors of the Vienna Academy could no longer teach at university. So they taught school children at like sort of a high end gymnasium. It, and he was selected to be taught. So he learned math, English. He knew English at that time, Latin. Um, he had learned all of this well before the war. Um, and things just got worse and worse there. His father looked at ways to see about leaving the country. Um, and he wrote letters trying to get sponsorship to come to the United States, to go to Shanghai, to go to I think the Dominican Republic, even in South America, trying to get asylum. But they weren't able to get it together to do any of that. It seems like, and eventually, cutting things really short, eventually they were all taken and transported to the Lodz ghetto, um, by first by motor vehicle and then by train. He was in the Lodz ghetto for several years, I think. His father died of starvation within a short time of him arriving. There just wasn't any food, and he couldn't get it together. I mean, he just struggled, and I mean, he died very quickly there. His mother, she was there for some time. Um, Eventually, there was a deportation, a selection, and she was taken. Um, at that time, so my grandfather, he was a little like blonde, blue-eyed kid, and that I guess what served him well, like being sort of German looking. They thought, and he also spoke very good German, which most people going along didn't really. Most people would be Polish speaking, native Polish speaking, and Yiddish speaking. So he didn't really. So he was able to really communicate well there. Um, but at the time his mother was taken, he went into the house. Um, and his neighbors who lived in that sort of apartment with them, he told them that his mother, they had took his mother, and the neighbor said, oh well, maybe you should go out and tell them that you want to go too. And he thought, the neighbors, later on he realized the neighbor was trying to get rid of him, but he went out in the street to ask the guards there, if he could go. You took my mother, and maybe I could go too. And they told him, get back in the house. um Schweinehund. It's like a pig dog. And they sent him back in, and probably saved his life, I would say. I mean, nobody ever heard from any of these people again. At that time, they probably went to Kelm. um, so he was alone in the ghetto. He was, a young kid, like maybe he was 14 at that time, 13, 14. I couldn't say honestly. I would have to do the math. I don't really remember.
That's fine.
Um, and after a time, he worked as a saddler, leather worker, I guess that would be. Um, After a time, he went to stay at the orphanage in the ghetto. And the orphanage, actually, they kept it. It was preserved up until the end, the very end. They didn't send out because they weren't children. They were over 13. They were older children, sort of. And they were kept alive in that orphanage by Chaim Ramkowski, who was the head of the Lodz Ghetto, um, until the end, until the ghetto was completely dissolved, which was, I guess, in 1944, I want to say. So, and they learned there. The person who ran the ghetto was in charge, sort of, was Franz Kafka's wife, who somehow, well, she was Jewish and she ended up in the ghetto. That's how. But she ran this ghetto for the older children. The young children in the Lodz ghetto were deported. Um, and that's just how they made, um, what do you call it? Made their the numbers, the quotas for deportations. But they stayed in this ghetto orphanage until the end of the war. Not the end of the war, I'm sorry, until the ghetto was formally dissolved. At that time, they were transported to Auschwitz, which was terrible. He got to Auschwitz. There was no food. It was a total, total shit show there, right? Um, and uh, he knew nobody could survive there for very long. He said, "This is terrible." And he heard that they were asking for volunteers for agricultural labor, and he said, "Well, agricultural labor, all right, whatever." Like, he told them he was 16, so he would be kept, and allowed to work. Um, so he spoke German, like I said, so he could understand what they were asking for and understand directions in a way that you certainly wouldn't be able to if you didn't weren't a native speaker of German. So agricultural work. Um, every day they went to a fish farm nearby to the main camp. It was sort of a subsidiary camp, Buddha, um, where they had these ponds with carp, and they would go out and handle the carp every day, march there and back to the main camp from the main camp from the main camp. Um, there was food saved for them, and he was a very slight person, tiny guy. He never grew. He was like way shorter than me, like 4 foot something, maybe. Um, but there was food for them at the end of every day. It was saved. Um, on the stuff on the bottom of the pot, there was maybe a little more like stuff there, meat and whatever at the bottom. And so they had not like a lot to eat, but what he said was almost like enough, um, to be able to do the work that they had. So he kind of they went along like this for some time. As Christmas approached, they were catching the fish and sending them in trucks to Germany, because I guess the Germans, they liked carp for Christmas. I don't know. Um, but he could see that the work was going to be finished when the carp were gone. And he kind of, at that point, they all knew what would happen when there was no work. So he went to the officer in charge of that part of the camp and told him, well, I have some extra time in the evenings. Um, I really, all this time I have on my hands after I spend all day catching fish, and maybe have some bookkeeping, because remember, he had been educated, they had math from the university professors they had taught, so before the ghetto. So he was able to pick up some bookkeeping. He was maybe like 15, I want to say. So he was able to pick up some bookkeeping from the officer, um, that handled the fish farm. And that went along for a little while, but it seemed like that work was going to be done. But then he got this other gig, handling the weather station. And he would walk out from the camp every day very slowly so as not to be, nobody would think he was escaping. He would walk to the weather station and take the, whatever it is, the metrics, um, and then walk back twice a day. And that was his work until such time as that camp was being dissolved. Um, at that time, everybody that was left alive, they were marched out of camp. They walked for, I don't even know how long, days. Um, People were shot. I mean, anybody that couldn't keep up, they would say, maybe you want to sit down and rest for a minute and catch the next batch of people coming. And of course, as soon as the next people would come along, they would just, shoot them. So he knew he had to keep going. They walked. Eventually, they got to rail and were transported by rail to Buchenwald. At that time, apparently, he had like an abscess in his foot after all this from the frostbite. And he was tended by a physician that happened to be on the train, who somehow had a piece of glass that, and lanced it for him, and they were able to tie it up, and he somehow was able to heal from this. Um, they got to Buchenwald, and that was, it seemed like, mostly political prisoners living there, being kept there at that time. Um, there was a factory, there were arms produced, something like this, and the political prisoners, they would smuggle like one piece of a weapon at a time from the factory, is what he said, and hide them and then reassemble them. Um, so that by the time the camp was liberated by allies, it there had been an uprising, and the political prisoners had taken the camp, is what they said. Um, and then the allies showed up. He was liberated on his 18th birthday, he says, April of 45. Um, After the camp was liberated, he says, a lot of people, they made food. People were starving. They all gorged themselves and died, apparently from like refeeding syndrome. And he kind of crawled off and found, he said, like a box of dog biscuits in a barn, and he ate those, and it like till he got his system back to some kind of state where he could tolerate normal foods. Um, After that, of course, he went back to Vienna eventually. Of course, there were other people living in the apartment that they had been in. I mean, I don't, and everything was gone. Um, he went from there to Salzburg, where he had another relative, um, and he was able to come up with a little bit of income going back and forth from Salzburg to Vienna, bringing cigarettes from the American soldiers in Salzburg, buying them up and selling them at a profit in Vienna. And he went back and forth a number of times, and got it together, and eventually made his way to emigrate. I think he emigrated in 1947. Came to the U.S., got married, you know, had a couple kids, lived in Queens for 50 years or something, maybe more.
Wow.
Um, so a bunch of things.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to know. I mean, the things we take for granted, especially knowing that his father died of starvation and then he himself had to go through, at such a young age, working all this hard manual labor and then barely, the food that he had was barely enough, just enough to him to just come again the other day, like the next day, just to work to make it through. I mean, him finding dog biscuits and food that was stored at the bottom where he was working at the fish farm. This is all like very important things to know.
um, yeah, I mean, in the ghetto, I think they said they would eat um, dandelions that would grow, weeds, the bottoms of grass, um, just any little bit of something. He would like forage in the lawn for weeds that might be edible. Um,
Wow, yeah. And then all these the way the places that he had to travel. I mean, every single move he had to make was so careful just to make sure that they wouldn't think. I mean, every second he probably spent fearing for his life. I mean, even when he was walking to the weather station, you mentioned how he couldn't walk at a faster pace so that they wouldn't think that he was escaping. I mean, even like he couldn't even take breaks from walking, which caused frostbites and what to call problems with his foot, just so that he like, what to call they would increase his chances of living. It was all very very important. Wow, the things that these people had to go through back then.
yeah, just a lot of lucky turns. I mean, it just so happened that, I mean, just so many things that were small advantages that he was able to seize upon. Um, Definitely a lot of luck.
Definitely. I mean, this is all some information. I mean, bit by bit, help him save his life. I mean, every single small step along the way helped him save his life. All of that came together. I mean, now to make such an event, something like the Holocaust, never ever be repeated because stories like this. I mean, to educate future generations as well on what these people had to go through. I mean, such an event. it's hard to think about. I mean, in today's date and age, I mean, us living in a developed country, I mean, away from such events, I mean, it is hard to imagine. I mean, we can never feel the pain that these people went through.
I would hope not.
Yeah, never. But yeah, this is all very great information on your grandfather. Definitely, what's it called? There's a couple of articles online about him as well that I've managed to go through. A lot of stories that he shared, and it's very inspiring and informative.
Yes, he was featured in the 60 Minutes forever ago about Bad Arelson, the archive. Um, Also in a couple of different films, Holocaust themed documentary. Um, and there is his Shoah testimony is available, I'm sure, through the Yad Vashem. It's very long, 3.5 hours of testimony. Kind of a lot to go through, but
But definitely, definitely we're doing all the information that he had to provide about his life. When did you say your grandfather passed away?
in 2017.
2017, so 3 years ago. Wow. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, all the story of his life, it definitely should always be remembered. And I'm glad all of this is available online and the different information that we can find on him.
Yeah, of course. It's
Uh, okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Randy,
Thank
for
you.
doing this, and definitely looking forward to always keeping your grandfather's name alive and his stories.
Well, thank you.
Perfect. All right. Thank